Hello, everyone. This is Danish. Welcome back. We are on the panel 1, Affordable Housing and Preservation Policies, Case Studies, and Lesson Learned here. Just going to read a little title here. As the affordable housing priorities of the new mayoral administration are still in development, the time is right to explore how preservation can support affordable housing in New York and how land use policy impact what is preserved. So I'm very happy here to introduce 3 panelists here. Caroline, who is a professor at history, data preservation, historic preservation and economic development, focusing on the relationship between the urban heritage conservations, urban regenerations, and the poverty reduction. She'll be our first presenter, will be followed by Layla Law, who is the chair of the Manhattan Community Board 5 Land Use, Housing, and Zoning Committee. And at the end, we'll have Rebecca, is currently a design program manager for real estate development at New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA. Caroline will be presenting online.
Okay. All right. So thank you so much for having me, everybody. I'm glad to sort of, see everybody there virtually at least. I'll go ahead and just dive in. The preservation and affordable housing, I'm going to be talking to you about one way that I think we can actually get preservation and affordable housing to work more in tandem rather than in opposition, which is generally the way that most people think of preservation and not just affordable housing, but economic development. So we will just go ahead and dive in. And I will start with this by saying that preservation, historic preservation has an image problem, right? It was evolved significantly from the days of elitism and representing monumentalist narratives of dead white men. But you really only need to scan preservation related headlines in the news to see that by and large, the preservation discipline is still very much accused of and seen, at least on a public level, as being elitist and in opposition to equity. Now we have both preservation supporters and its critics who are increasingly demanding greater and more comprehensive inclusion of minority and marginalized communities within the preservation process. And the thought is that, by including communities, we can ensure fair distribution of preservation's costs and benefits. And I and many others, I really do believe that, given the current climate of political and social dialogue, that it really is to our benefit right now to take advantage of this moment and, sort of seize the moment to kind of reshape the image of preservation and to show that it can be applicable to contemporary issues and really address ideas that preservation is incompatible with equity, because in reality, preservation can contribute preservation can contribute rather than detract from equity and justice when it's done with some thought. So the way that I have been framing this is an equity preservation agenda. And again, as you can see, it includes marginalized groups through participatory agency. And I'm just going to go ahead and read a definition that I've crafted of what I believe to be an equity preservation agenda. It's a process through which historically marginalized groups exercise greater participatory agency in identifying, elevating, and protecting the place-based histories of racial, ethnic, gender, income, and class-based groups. An equity preservation approach works towards distributive, perhaps reparative, parity with regard to both process and outcome. And in doing so, preservationists can enable outcomes that provide a counter narrative to the field's perceptions of elitism and exclusion, placing the discipline at the front of current conversations surrounding social justice and equity. So it's a lot of words there. I totally understand that. But, I think the key takeaways, again, are marginalized groups are put at the center through a participatory process that really puts agency or gives agency to these groups. And in doing so, has, a sort of redistributive process and outcome towards equality. But the big question, right? That's sort of a big pie in the sky idea is, again, but how, right? That's the question that everybody asks. Okay, this is all great and well and fine, but but how do we actually do this? Excuse me. So there are many, many answers and many, many thoughts on how to get this done. So, I'm not going to say that we have all of the answers, but I think that there are a number of tools that within the preservation field, we have not yet even begun to explore or take advantage of for a number of reasons. They're uncomfortable for us. They make us, we don't really understand them. We view them as, being a part of somebody else's lane, right? But a big part of what I think we need to do in order to, move towards a equity preservation agenda is cross over into some of those lanes and at least shake hands with the people in those other lanes to try to understand what tools they might have that we can apply to our own work, right? Because the world doesn't operate in silos, unfortunately. And so to the extent that we can try to break down those silos, it's to the benefit of everybody. So here I propose one tool of many that I believe to have great potential to respond to this question of how to actually increase equity and preservation, again, through the lens of affordable housing, which are community land trusts. First, a quick, I don't need to sort of go over any of these facts to you who, in New York City about the affordable housing crisis in New York City. I did just see a statistic that New York is now the second least affordable housing market in the country, second to Miami. But again, so I also saw one statistic that said, with a projected median household income of $68,000 and a median asking price for buyers of $970,000, that would mean that a household would be spending 78% of their income on mortgage and taxes. So as we can see, it's not affordable for most people. Again, with the sort of census-based definition of extremely low income being any household that makes less than 30% of the area median income, we go even further to say that more than 25% of households in New York City are severely rent burdened, meaning they spend more than 50% of their income on rent. And then that bumps up to almost double that, to 50% of households are rent burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on rent. So, this is a severe problem in New York City, especially, but really across the country too, as well, obviously focused on, urban centers. And what we see in these urban centers is that, especially in the last couple of years with, the increases in property values, is that the gap between housing costs and wages, this sort of disparity and difference leads to homelessness and overcrowding on the streets, overcrowding in many of these structures. So community land trusts, I'll just do a super quick overview of what CLTs are. I'm going to assume that most of you have at least a sort of rudimentary knowledge of what they are, but basically it separates the value between the property itself and the land. So what that means is that we have leaseholders or residents, community representatives, public representatives. The CLT is a third organization that actually owns the land itself, but the resident buys the house with restrictions on resale and use. There's generally the resident takes on a long-term lease, usually 99 years of land. And so by separating these two values, the resident or the purchaser or the renter, depending on who it is able to recoup the value of that. I don't know how to get rid of that. There we go. So this model allows for lower purchasing prices. It preserves long-term affordability in the neighborhood. And then usually the CLT model encompasses community-based counseling and education as well for community members and buyers or excuse me, renters. So again, community benefits or CLT benefits. It increases the affordable housing stock. It increases community wealth and improves community involvement, neighborhood stabilization as well, diversity and inclusivity. And then for individual households, you see higher percentages of renters becoming owners. And it's actually most of the time they're first-time home buyers who are entering into the CLT model. So it allows them a method to build wealth. So there are many avenues for both the community and individuals to benefit from the CLT model itself. And interestingly enough, the question when I first started understanding what CLTs were, the question that kept coming to mind was, okay, but CLTs, generally they're used in agricultural, models or urban centers, but why can't they be used to involve historic housing stock as well, whether that's designated historic housing stock or undesignated historic housing stock, right? It's still one building that might be used for affordable housing, and it might be historic as well, right? So 2 birds, 1 stone. So one of the case studies that I was looking at, or that I am looking at, is Champlain Housing Trust in Vermont. It's the very first housing trust in the country, and it covers a very, very vast territory in Vermont, 3 counties right there. So, knowing that most of the Northeast has historic housing, again, designated and undesignated, the question that I went into with this was, well, exactly how is the housing trust viewing their activity? Do they view it as preservation of historic homes, or are they viewing it, are they focused more on the affordable housing side? What's the connection that they as an organization are making, and what can we take away from that? So in my conversations with the former executive director, she acknowledged, they're part of the community. History is a part of the buildings, but their primary goal is to create low-cost housing. That said, they are still involving and taking on historic preservation projects, right? Converting a former dungaree factory into 28 affordable homes in a historic area, right? And so when they do this, they are actually abiding by certain preservation regulations for windows and for housing quality and construction modes as well. So they are doing historic preservation, but again, there's that public image disjuncture, right, where they don't necessarily want to say that they're doing preservation, even though they are. Again, largest CLT in the nation. They have almost 3,000 at this point affordable homes, 530 of which are focused on ownership. And 2/3 of their sellers go on to buy in the private market with really low rates of foreclosure compared to the private market, right? A number of their projects are actually focused on people coming out of homelessness, abusive relationships, or people who are in need of social services. So really in this model, at least, CLTs are serving as a way to provide both preservation of affordable housing and historic housing, historic structures. And in doing so, they're providing access to housing, to markets, and to spaces, really, that these households might have been barred from as barriers to entry before. So it's shifting the balance of preservation towards economic and social and physical equity in this realm. Now, I don't have time to, I don't have time to go into other examples, but there are other examples of CLTs that I have found that in which that balance is actually shifted, in which a CLT is really focused explicitly on historic preservation as their primary goal, and then affordable housing as well. But, I've sort of, at this point, I'm sort of taking the perspective of, it doesn't necessarily matter what the organization is prioritizing. What does matter is that they are doing both, right? They're abiding by the historicity of the structures and seeing the value in these historic buildings, while also prioritizing the provision of affordable housing and social equity. So again, this isn't a panacea, as I said earlier, but I do think for a model like CLTs and any other model that is trying to work towards an equity preservation agenda, it really, the success of these kinds of tools really depends on the market and the governance conditions, right? You have to have a government that is supportive of these types of tools, as well as a market that can support these tools. And there needs to be checks and balances, whether that's built into the model, like a CLT model, or a third party who can kind of say, hey, actually, this value is getting pushed to the wayside, and you might want to think about this, right? But I think key to any of this is that there has to be deliberate inclusion in the preservation process. It can't just be perfunctory, right? It has to be something that is at the outset decided that we are going to, not just give these groups a seat at the table, but empower them. And give agency to these traditionally marginalized groups. It's a creation of opportunity to encourage equality where it's lacking and inclusion where it's lacking. And throughout this process, this thoughtful process, we can really, I think, facilitate an equity preservation agenda. So with that, I think I am close to my time, but I thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Caroline. I think we'll take the question at the end. We'll move to Layla Law. Yes. Hi, Layla.
Hi, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. It is an honor to be with you. I have a presentation that can go up. I can also share my screen if it's more convenient. I think you should have the presentation on your end, but if easier, I can share my screen. Just let me. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right, thank you so much. So my name is Layla Law-Gisiko. I am the chair of the Land Use, Housing and Zoning Committee of Manhattan Community Board 5, which covers most of Midtown. Actually core central Midtown, going from 14th Street to 59 and from Lexington to 8th Avenue. I think all of you are very familiar with this district. And I am very pleased to talk about the interaction between the 421A program, which is a tax break incentive that is under the purview of the state of New York, but applies only to the city, and how it actually impacts our housing stock as well as our preservation impetus. So the 421A is a tax incentive program, as I said, that basically has had a great consequence on promoting and stimulating overdevelopment. And because there's such a scarcity of land in our part of the city, in Manhattan in general, it has had the impact of actually promoting demolition rather than preservation. So it is an interesting effect of the 421A, and it has been used to frame a narrative by pro-development groups to actually say that, you know, this is the only way to actually solve our housing crisis. So what I'm going to offer is to actually take a look at the numbers to dispel some of these notions and debunk some of these assertions so that we can reframe the narrative. And we're going to realize that actually housing policies and a preservation, historic preservation effort can work in tandem. So what is the 421A program? So it is an as-of-right tax incentive program available to developers of rental and condo buildings that provide a tax abatement for 10 to 25 years in exchange for the construction of 20 to or 30% affordable housing. The program has known a variety of incarnations. It used to be that the program could be used for off-site development, meaning that a developer would put a market rate luxury condo, let's say, to pick one example, on 57th Street, also known as Billionaires Row, and would benefit from the program, and in exchange would build a rental building in the Bronx. And this rental building would be affordable. The problem that we have seen with this framework is that very often the tax break is much more generous than the affordable housing that is being produced. So as I said in my introduction, what it has done, especially in our part of the city in Manhattan that is already very densely built, is that, you know, it is a great tool of incentivizing construction. But given that there is very, very little available land in Manhattan, then it has basically created an incentive, a huge incentive to actually demolish our existing stock of buildings. To give you a data point, in the past 10 years, Community Board 5 has seen the demolition of 10% of its built environment, which means that, if we keep going at this pace, we're going to replace our entire stock of buildings in the course of buildings lifetime, which is considered to be 99 years. As you can see, there is a perverse incentive to actually destabilize and demolish our built environment. So here is how this sort of perpetual loop works. So the developers make this assumption: housing is so expensive because it costs so much to build. We need a tax break to build more and make it more affordable. So the New York State responds, okay, here's the 421A. You won't have to pay property taxes on new development for decades. The landowner then says, well, if the developers are saving big with the 421A, I bet they'll pay more for the parcel that I've got. So the developer says, okay, I'll pay more upfront because I know I'll save on taxes for years to come. Let me just get a bigger loan.
Layla, sorry to interrupt. Can you just widescreen put your whole screen up so that
oops, I'm actually in full screen mode. Can you see my screen?
Like present mode.
Just put it in the present mode, probably. That will give us the full screen.
Okay, is it better?
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so here is where we were. Okay, so basically the loop. The developer says housing is too expensive. We need a tax break. The state says, okay, here's the 421A. The landowner then decides that they want to capture some of the value of this tax break. So they basically make the assumption developers are going to save big with the 421A. They will pay more for this parcel I've got. The developer says, I'll pay more upfront because I know I'll save on taxes for years to come. Let me just get a bigger loan. So the lenders and investors says, sure, you can take on more debt for this project, but you're going to have to make some bigger payments. The developer says, okay, I'll set first rents high enough to cover all this debt service, and then I'll sell my condos at high price too. And then you go back. This is why housing is so expensive. This is, the cycle of funding basically cuts through the notion of housing. As you can see here, we're not really talking about housing. We're talking about an investment tool, speculative action around land and a product that is then portrayed as housing, but that really is, when we talk about the market is commanding, we need more supply because the market needs to regulate. We miss the fact that we're not talking about housing market here. We're talking about a speculative market that may have a housing as collateral, but it is not the main function of this market. So let's dig into a case study, Billionaires Row. 157, which, if you can see my cursor, is this building in the middle, was the first super tall along Central Park. It was built under the 421A program. The developer constructed affordable housing in the Bronx and in exchange received a massive tax break passed on to condo unit owners. So the amount of housing that was produced in exchange for this tax break was actually pretty modest. It was in the Bronx. That doesn't really need, that kind of stimulus to build more housing. So it did not create affordable housing on site. But also the value of this housing that was built is absolutely not commensurate with the value of the tax break. So currently, as you know, the 421A has known a number of incarnations. This kind of development is no longer permissible. You have to build on site. But nonetheless, we still have many of these remnants because the tax breaks continues while the affordable housing is off-site. So to make way for 157 new condo uber luxury tower, what's interesting to note in how it impacts housing is that a lot of rental buildings were actually demolished. So instead of creating housing, the 421A actually destabilized an entire neighborhood. According to census data, the area saw a loss of inhabitants. So this is something that we really need to wrap our heads around. We have built some of the tallest and densest buildings in terms of built density, and we have seen a reduction in the number of people who live in this area. And the reduction is actually significant. I think it's a 3% reduction, which is significant in sheer numbers and also statistically significant. So home suite, unaffordable home. Another trait of the 421A is that if it's affordable housing that it's supposed to create, why is it so expensive? Developers in rental buildings can set the level of affordability in their rentals for the affordable portion of the building that typically today has 30% units that are set for affordable units. They can set this affordability level from 40% of the MAI to 160% of the MAI. And in some cases, it can actually go all the way up to 200% of the MAI. So there is an example in this chart that we can go through a couple of lines. For example, 1225 42nd Street in Borough Hall, the affordable rent for a 2-bedroom at 130 MAI, the tenants would pay $2,710. Okay, the median neighborhood asking rent for a 2-bedroom is $2,000. So basically, under the 421A, the units are actually more expensive than the median neighborhood asking rent. And this is a situation that we see over and over and over. In my little list that I compiled with the help of housing with StreetEasy and Housing Connect, the examples are actually not in Manhattan, but we have similar examples in Manhattan, including in rental buildings in Hudson Yards that basically offer units that are under the 421A, deemed affordable, but are similar in price to the median neighborhood asking rent. So as you can see, they are deemed affordable, but they are actually not affordable. Another case study to actually show how preservation stabilizes neighborhoods. Clinton, the neighborhood of Hell's Kitchen. So the Clinton Special District, located, fronting mostly 9th Avenue in Hell's Kitchen, has actually a large stock of older buildings. The Clinton Special District zoning has a number of provisions that actually encourage preservation. And this goal has been mostly attained. So this large stock of older buildings is actually a very good way to preserve housing. Those are what I call good citizen buildings. Mostly the land is unencumbered from a mortgage. Speculation may have been there when they were built, but it has run its course. And now what these buildings do is not enrich bankers and lenders. They basically just fulfill their job of providing housing to tenants who need it. So, they provide a robust source of market rate housing that remains affordable. And preserving this stock of buildings is actually a much better tool of housing affordability and stability. So this is where you see that preservation is actually housing's ally. Historic preservation and housing stabilization have shared outcomes and interests. And although the narrative today has been reframed to make us believe that we need to demolish and rebuild, that we need to increase the stock of buildings with new construction, you can see that actually it is very often done at the expense of existing units that are affordable, and that we would benefit much more from keeping and stabilizing this stock. And something also that is important to note is that these tools of preservation, whether for historic preservation or housing preservation, also provide great stability for small businesses.
Layla, we are reaching the time limit.
Yeah, I'm going to wrap up. I'm almost there. So how much does the 421A program cost? Basically 1.7 billion on tax exemptions, and over 30 years, 22.2 billion. What could we have done with that money? Going forward, partnership is really the key. We need policy changes to focus on a partnership between historic preservation and housing preservation to support our robust existing housing stock while making way for responsible new development. And that is my conclusion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Now I present Rebecca Fitzgerald.
Program
I think we can't hear.
Is that, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing with the State Historic Preservation Office to list NYCHA developments in the National Register and use the Historic Tax Credit Program to support our comprehensive rehab programs. One of my jobs is developing and implementing design standards, working with teams of architects and engineers. Presentation deck. So just thank you. So one of my jobs is developing and implementing design standards. I work with teams of architects and engineers to build out best practices for the substantial rehabs of a really architecturally diverse portfolio of buildings, with critical need of not only major capital repairs, but also investment in new building systems, new spaces, new programming, ultimately with the goal of improving building performance and setting buildings up for many future generations. So historic preservation and the tax credit program have been increasingly important to our planning and execution of these projects. I'll go through a little bit of background on our buildings and our work, and then talk about a few specific examples. So this is just starting us out with a bit of context, just to get a sense of the scale of the Nycha portfolio. Nycha has somewhere in the order of 328 developments across all 5 boroughs, and each development can be a collection of buildings. So the individual building count is actually much higher. That portfolio can be broken down into purpose-built and rehabs. The rehabs were acquired by Nycha, many in the 60s and 70s, and were gut renovated. And the first of the purpose-built developments was constructed, as many probably know, in 1936. Many of those have also been substantially rehabilitated over their lifetimes. This is another way to look at the portfolio. So the green and the gray are purpose-built or new construction by Nycha, and the yellow and orange are rehabs. And at the top, they're organized by number of stories, at the bottom by building area. This is one graphic in a much larger ongoing study with a team of architects and engineers, the goal of which is to build out a parametric model that will allow us to generate more precise benchmarks for things like building performance, energy consumption, upfront and maintenance costs, and other factors, and then suites of typical rehab interventions to meet those benchmarks. It responds not only to physical parameters, but also to regulatory ones, like the potential for listing in the National Register. So zooming out a little bit to Nycha history, and right now I'll caveat by saying that I'm looking at Nycha history through the lens of its design programs. These two photos represent two of the major movements in the history of Nycha's design programs. On the left is the dedication of Harlem River Houses in 1937, which kicked off decades of production of new construction housing by Nycha. The dominant type during this period was the superblock campus, like Harlem River. And it was during this time that Nycha had its standard details program. There were at least 4 iterations between the 1940s and the early 1960s. And they standardized everything from signage to benches and wall assemblies. On the right is the groundbreaking of what we call now Davidson Houses, which was designed by Paul Rudolph. And this was after, about the mid 1960s, there was a shift from standardization to one-off designs by architecture firms that didn't work primarily in affordable or public housing. So this period saw a proliferation of buildings with different massing, materiality, and typical assemblies. That conversation had been happening at Nycha since the late 50s at least, but in 1967 was the year that the Urban Design Group was formed by Mayor Lindsay's office, which put into practice a lot of those conversations about how design programs might push for new models and aesthetics beyond, or in some cases alongside, standardization. So this is just a selection of buildings in the Nycha portfolio. It's a representative cross-section, I'd say, just to get a sense of the breadth of architectural history that's captured by Nycha buildings. And we'll talk about some of these developments in a bit more detail. But the other thing to note is that at the same time as the Nycha Standard Details program was phased out, Nycha was also acquiring a number of pre-war buildings across the city and gut renovating them, often from SROs, to become multifamily housing. And the last moment in this very short history of Nycha happened in 2017 and takes us up to today. So on the left in black are 38 developments, and then on the right, the 3 developments in blue. The ones in black are part of the 2017 Nycha and SHPO Section 106 programmatic agreement, the goal of which was primarily to streamline environmental review for Nycha capital work. As part of the agreement, those 38 developments were identified as either National Register listed or National Register eligible. Since then, in the last couple of years, recognizing the benefit of historic preservation and the tax credit program to buildings undergoing substantial rehabilitation, we've worked with consultants and with the State Historic Preservation Office to have an additional 3 developments, the ones in blue, evaluated and listed. And our goal is to formalize that collaboration going forward for projects that can benefit from the program. And to note about the more recently evaluated developments is that in some cases, they've been evaluated less on the merits of their architectural significance and more on what they represent for Nycha's history and the history of public housing as culturally and historically significant. From an architectural perspective, the challenge of working on these kinds of projects is not only the complexity that comes along with historic preservation rehab, but also the incredibly complex regulatory environment that we work in. So this is not comprehensive, but on the left are some of the standards and drivers that we negotiate when designing and constructing rehab projects. And the collaboration that we've been working through with SHPO has been really essential to our ability to balance all of these drivers. I'll speak to some of the sustainability and the accessibility drivers in particular with two of our case studies. So we will take a very quick look at two developments that are just beginning construction on their rehabs, Harlem River Houses and Williamsburg Houses. They have gone through a lengthy design phase and in consultation with SHPO have negotiated between those multiple sets of drivers, goals, and stakeholders. And in some ways, these were relatively straightforward from the preservation perspective. They were both already landmarked. So the challenge was less in advocating for their significance or identifying character defining features and more in mediating between sustainability goals, local law compliance, accessibility standards, and a sensitive, well-designed preservation project. This is a little bit more about Harlem River Houses. So both Harlem River and Williamsburg were built by the Public Works Administration housing program. They were both designed as cities within cities, so large campuses with multiple scales of outdoor space. And a major focus of the rehab design by Curtis and Ginsburg has been restoring the landscape plan. Though with contemporary needs and contemporary code and federal accessibility regulations in mind. So at the top, you can see a drawing of new guardrails around restored sunken play areas and new accessible ramps. And then for me, one of the especially exciting features of this rehab is the conversion to electric heat pumps for space heating and cooling. So this is a case where pushing for a major upgrade to building systems, the benefits of which are not only compliance with local laws, our ability to meet sustainability goals, improve resident comfort and health and safety, but all of that was also aligned to historic preservation goals. So in installing a new heating and cooling system with the HVAC equipment on the roof, all of the window ACs could be removed and the windows could be replaced with high performance windows that look quite similar to the ones that were originally installed. And I should note that the original windows had already been replaced in the 80s, so there was no restoration that was possible, unfortunately. Switching over quickly to Williamsburg Houses. This is the original site plan. You can see some of the similarities to Harlem River. So we have a super block campus and the siding and massing frame large and smaller interior courts. But Williamsburg has a set of conditions that are incredibly challenging to resolve with respect to accessibility. So not only are there grade changes across the site, but you can see on the left that the first residential level is actually about 4 feet above grade. There are breezeways accessed by stairs that provide access to some ground floor units. There are no elevators, and you can see in the plan on the right that otherwise residential units are accessed from very narrow stair course. So unfortunately, I don't have any drawings I can share right now of the rehab design, but it's something that the architects are working with us and SHPO and FHEO in real time. I think when completed, it's going to be a good example of how regulations, design, and preservation can work together. So finally, I wanted to touch on a few projects on the horizon. This is Classen Point Gardens. It's already National Register eligible with a major redesign by Oscar Newman in the 1970s that, based on early conversations at least, I think will make the design of the rehab project really interesting, both from an architectural and a preservation perspective. On the left is the original facade. In the middle, an image from Newman's defensible space. And on the right, an image from after the buildings were reclad as part of Newman's renovation. So within Newman's overall idea about inscribing individual responsibility into spaces, he also developed a system at Classen Point Gardens for giving residents a choice about how their unit would be reclad. His firm set up cladding mock-ups around the campus, and residents were able to choose from multiple colors, which results in that banding across the buildings. And this is something that we're interested in responding to in the future rehab. So not only the architectural qualities of the redesign, but the history of the process of participatory design and community engagement. Taking another look at some of the changes from the original design. On the left is the 1940s site plan. You can see the buildings are townhouse units with individual entries, but otherwise surrounded by open shared space. And after Newman's redesign, the outdoor spaces were broken down and aligned with individual units. So I wanted to finish up with a few ongoing projects from our design research studio that will continue to intersect with our work with the New York SHPO. First, we're working with teams of architects to conduct pre-design and planning studies at multiple developments. They're helping identify major challenges as well as design opportunities, but also building out our documentation of the histories of these sites, some of which are not listed in the 2017 programmatic agreement and may not have a resource evaluation on file. They're doing archival research, but they're also recording oral histories in conversation with property management and residents, many of whom are second generation, not only at their developments, but in their units. And finally, we're starting to build out our standards and best practices for deep energy retrofit on historic sites. So this is just an early study, but on the left are a group of buildings, some of which have already been identified as National Register eligible, some of which have not. And below, a number of potential typical rehab details, all with the goal of improving thermal and moisture performance of the building envelope, meeting the same performance targets, but with a variety of options for cladding, either from the outside or the inside, depending on the potential for historic preservation. And I will end there and open it up to questions.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. That was an insightful presentation. So I have mainly to all our panelists, thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I have two general questions, probably to all the panelists, but to start with, beside what you have presented, do you see other tools or legislation that could help align preservation and affordable housing goals? Anyone can. Caroline? Layla?
Yes. Yeah, I have a hard time hearing you. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
And-
I'll get a stab at this one. Yeah, I think that, you know, on the legislative front, there are lots of things that can be done. I think that, you know, promoting and incentivizing preservation is going to go a long way, and we need to do it with the idea that it is going to help supporting housing. Right now, there's such a big incentive to demolish buildings that it is very, very hard. If we shift this this incentive, if we put you know, the positive incentives on preserving buildings, then this is where you're going to see a shift. Because currently, you know, we have, as you know, a very powerful real estate industry that is basically in the business of constructing. And, you know, I think we can't blame the developers for what they're doing. It's their job and they're pretty good at it. What we need is a better regulatory framework with the correct incentives. I believe that the production of market rate housing does not need to be subsidized. I mean, we've seen it all over Manhattan. You know, it is happening regardless of tax incentives. What we need to incentivize is actually the retention of existing stock of housing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would absolutely, ditto all of that. We absolutely need to incentivize the retention of housing before we, demolish it, because as sort of the simplest law of physics, right? Once it's gone, it's gone, and we can't get it back. I would say that, I think the tools that we have right now, as I said in my presentation, they tend to be very siloed, right? So we have tax abatement programs, and we have other kinds of tax-based systems and incentives that are very focused on preserving a specific kind of housing. And they all have sort of, the pluses in one column, but minuses in another, right? And it's often to the detriment of historic preservation. Some of these conversations around tax abatements as a sort of stopgap for gentrification. There's a lot of arguments that those aren't necessarily as effective as we would like them to be. And that goes for any number of incentive. And so I think in addition to what Layla has said, one of the things that I think we need to do is look at the toolkit that we have right now. What do we have, that exists? And where can we, marry incentives so that we can fulfill, preservation as well as, or the retention of historic structures as well as affordable housing. And I think one of those is, I think not enough attention has been paid to twinning historic preservation tax credits with low-income housing tax credits, in large part because it's complicated, right? It's developers are super smart, they know what they're doing, they're savvy, but they're also, they're on a time crunch. And twinning tax credits like that takes time and it takes expertise, and not a lot of places actually have that expertise and the knowledge of the wherewithal that, one, you can actually twin these credits, or two, of how to actually do that. So in some ways, there is sort of an education need, I think, within the development community, that these kinds of incentives exist, or and it doesn't have to be low-income housing tax credits, right? It's new market tax credits as well. It's other kinds of incentives that can be used to fulfill this singular purpose of preserving affordable housing within historic housing stock.
Thank you. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I will just say that I agree. I think coordination is really coordination amongst the tools that we have and the stakeholders that we have is, at least in my job, a primary concern. And I think a lot of progress can be made just by identifying and analyzing. I think the word twinning is really useful to think about. And then on the design side, because a lot of preserving affordable housing and historic preservation, the overlap between those two assumes that we're rehabbing buildings, investing in them so that they can last for many, many more generations, many future decades. So as an architect, that is a lot of what I think about is making the industry standard of rehabilitation more robust and finding ways to marry concerns about sustainability and resiliency with historic preservation, which I think are natural partners. But on the architecture and engineering side, we still have work to do to standardize the approaches that we use that formalize the shared goals between those multiple programs or ideas.
Thank you very much. I think I'll open to the audience, please.
Thank you so much. I think the panelists present many issues, or many questions. Each of them will require probably one day of discussion, but I'm going to be very briefly with the first two. And I think in Florida, probably we discuss what it is on a horizontal city versus a dense city or vertical city. It's hard to apply most of the principles. The principles are very good. Very quick comment about that. The other comment is about, since I live on above the community number 5, so I know more or less the issue of that the Layla presented to us, I think she's absolutely right. The only thing I had to convey with her is the loss of scale, creating a shadow of the iconic buildings such as the Empire State, Chrysler, Citicorp. These needle buildings actually completely changed the landscape of the city of New York. No anymore. In the past, we can see it. Chrysler, Empire State, and Citicorp, because of these needle buildings. And the only thing I had to be in disagreement is, yes, those needle buildings are extremely for luxury people, and they are very big, and therefore is rather to have a high density, have lowest density. And so I think I'm run away from them. So now I think I'm gonna go with you, because I think it's the most complex issue that I found it. Let me start asking the first question. How many people lives in Nycha? I think I'm going to help you because I don't want to put in a hot seat. I think it's 160,000 people.
I think
so.
Something
Probably is the second largest city in the state. So it is a city within the city. And I think it's, with all respect, I think it's impossible to manage Nycha. Nycha is poorly managed, this part. I started.
So can we stick to the question?
Yeah. Okay.
There are other people also wants to ask.
So
the question.
finally,
We are
I study very well Isaac and Holmes Towers. I found that to redevelopment that site is a shame. Why? Because those sites are within the flooding zone, and having in the flooding zone to reveal anything is, I think, is senseless. And my question to you is, why you are planning to use the unused or poorly used the land use in Nycha, for instance, in those towers, in those places. I'm finished.
Please.
In those parts, for instance, I can easily save $300 and $400 million just using the lands properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, ma'am.
On the topic of 421A, there's been a lot of critics for many years, and now quite a few city council members are coming out and saying that they oppose 421A, but they want to do something else. They want to give a tax break to commercial property owners instead of a tax break to developers. And I'm just wondering, Layla, what you think of that, and also, are you proposing an alternative to 421A, or just get rid of it altogether, or what would you suggest to incentivize the preservation of existing housing?
Yes, sure. So the one thing that is important to remember is that the 421A program is a state program. It applies to the city, but it is dealt with by the state. So it's the state legislature and the governor who basically have final say. Not to say that the city council does not weigh in, but they don't have the decision power on that. So as you know, it is set to sunset in June. And I personally think it's a good thing. We need to let it, just let it sunset. First of all, it has happened in the past. In 2015, it did sunset, and we actually saw a great deal of development in real estate activity and construction activity. So, this fear that if it disappears, then it's going to, entirely stall an industry is incorrect. The second thing I would say, just to echo the great presentation that Caroline gave us, is that I think that community land trusts are really the way. We need to undercut the speculative nature of the land. If we're really serious about creating housing that remains housing, we need to undercut the speculative nature of the land. And the only way to do that is to basically acquire the land under some sort of a government program and develop the housing so that it remains housing. One very good example of that is the co-op complex known as Penn South in the West 20s along 8th and 9th Avenues, limited equity co-op, where basically you own the right to stay in the apartment and live in the apartment in perpetuity. It is your apartment, but you don't own the equity. And it was meant to be an experiment. It was widely successful and never repeated. How about we go and put a legal and land use framework to actually be able to replicate it. We don't need it to be 15 buildings and 5 city blocks. We can do it on a smaller scale. But I'm very inspired by Caroline's presentation. I think it was very insightful, and those are ideas that New York City and Manhattan need to really seriously consider. And on the tax breaks to commercial properties, I'm not sure that there are any really formal tax break incentive programs from the state. There are tax break incentive programs in land that is owned by the state, and that includes Hudson Yards, and that could include the area around Penn Station if the general project plan is approved. I am staunchly opposed to it. It is ridiculous, unnecessary, a distortion of market. It is anti-capitalistic, and I think that these tax breaks need to be prevented at all costs.
Thank you. That's really... Maybe one last question.
Thank you. Some of the panelists talked about the need to preserve affordable housing and how historic preservation can help with that. I live on the Upper West Side, and on my street, a number of what were originally single-family homes had been converted into multiple units, and now in the last 10 years have been converted back into single-family homes. And that's caused a loss of some of those naturally occurring affordable units. So how can preservation kind of deal with some of the challenges around that we can regulate aesthetics and we can keep these buildings, but at least in New York, we can't regulate use? What are some tools to try to make sure that we continue to preserve units, not just buildings? Thank you.
Anyone?
I'm happy to try to touch on this one, and then maybe pass it to my colleague of Nycha. I think that there are some ways to actually regulate use. It cannot be under LPC rules, but HPD as well as the Department of City Planning can actually introduce tools in their toolbox so that we have more stability. New York tends to say, oh, the tools don't exist. The tools are not in the toolbox. Well, we have a city council. That's their job to, introduce laws and introduce bills, pass laws. I think that, we don't need a big revamp of the charter to actually decide to say that, some of these buildings of lower scale that are, multifamily buildings must remain such so that they accommodate, more of their purpose as housing, rather than being converted to single family homes. Once again, the legislative tools may not exist currently, but that's the nature of the beast. That's why we have active legislative bodies. That's what they do to actually adapt and regulate.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that there's a lot more flexibility potentially than we imagine, and also the tools that we have available to us are robust. On my end, where my work intersects with historic preservation, we're regulated by HUD, obviously, and the use of NYCHA buildings, the unit mix, the unit count, those are gospel, and so that's built into all of the preservation work that we do. Either way, I'll say even if we don't have a kind of formalized way more broadly in the preservation community to regulate use in this way that you're describing, As we're starting to expand the way that we talk about historic preservation beyond just the aesthetics or the historic significance of the architecture, but also to social and cultural history, I think talking about use and talking about preserving usability as multifamily housing or affordable multifamily housing is a logical next step.
Thank you.